In the Battletech tactics that we've been exploring, we've been focusing on this idea in Battletech. The core tactica is that it is a battle of dice modifiers. As an attacker, I'm trying to keep my modifiers low. I do this through range. I do this through movement. Obviously, the greater the range of the weapon, the higher the modifier. And whether I'm walking, running, or jumping, that's going to increase my modifier. And against the attacker, they're trying to increase my modifiers further by how many hexes did they run? Possibly, are they prone? We're looking at possible terrain interactions. So it's this back and forth where I'm trying to get that number low. My opponent's trying to keep it high, and I am trying to roll hot, trying to roll lucky on the dice. But within this, of course, there are things that you can do to increase your ability to hit. We see this idea of redundancy. If I'm firing one PPC, the chances are better if I'm firing two or three medium lasers versus one. And of course, depending on the era or the rules you're interacting with, tech, you might have a targeting computer, pulse lasers, other types of things that will increase or decrease ECM systems, your modifiers. So within this framework, let's jump into terrain. Because Battletech is really interesting in that you can play the core rules as is, but then depending on your experience, what you're feeling, and time in game, you can make it more complex. You can add combined arms. You can add artillery. You can add air support. You can add different levels of terrain, city fights, city tech, and come up with a very tactically complicated game in a good way, or you can dial it down based on what you're playing. So within that framework, terrain, the question is, can you destroy terrain? Can you interact with terrain? And yes or no, depending on what you're playing. So let's talk about city fight, city tech, because this is where we really encounter a lot of the core rules, or I should say core possibilities for terrain interaction. We've got buildings, we've got roads, and then let's say we have area terrain like forests or parks. And of course, there's some terrain that falls side out of that, but that's kind of the primary terrain that you're going to encounter. Now, in the basic game, terrain isn't really destructible. I mean, you might shoot at it and in the theater of your mind, see it on fire and see it breaking and burning and all that, but I can't destroy those buildings. So if there's a building in between us, if I don't have jump jets, there's not that much that I can do. Likewise, moving through a forest or a park, there is going to be possibly some movement modifiers and some cover modifiers based on the unit, but it kind of just exists there, even though it is, again, in the theater of the mind, taking that damage. And this is a great way to play Battletech. But as you scale up in City Fight, City Tech, what we now begin to see is that buildings are assigned a structural hardness value. Essentially, how much damage is it going to take to collapse the building? And once it collapses, what happens is now it becomes kind of rubble and difficult terrain to move through, again, depending on your vehicle, your mech, and how it interacts with infantry. It can also depend if a mech is on top of it, you're going to take falling damage. What we see, jump jets is kind of like, I would say for City Fight, City Tech, it is very important, but you got to be careful with the jump jets in this type of scenario, because if I'm moving down a street and we've got some targets, maybe we've got some infantry in the buildings, I want to just bypass that. If I leap up onto a building, I can bypass that. But now, depending on the elevation of other city streets, other opposing mechs or targets are all going to have a line of sight to me. I might have a line of sight to them also. So what we see is when you jump up on top of a building, an opposing mech, an opposing unit. This is one of the reasons, on a side note, the Demolisher heavy tank, one of my favorite tanks. I pushed up that Tactica to the Battletech playlist. The Demolisher, heavily armored, on a turret, 2 autocannon 20s. I will use these in City Fight, City Tech to literally clear the way, to just blast and level buildings in one shot. One round of shooting. If I've got 2 Demolisher tanks auto hitting, that's going to be 2 AC-20s times 4 hits it's going to level everything. If you hit that building and there's a mech on top, that mech is taking falling damage, has to make piloting checks. There's also rules for basements and sub-basements. So depending on the building, you might be falling 1, 2, or 3 levels. You might fall further than that. You also see where, depending on the tonnage, you can move through buildings. And if there's a basement, crash into the building. Depending on the rule set of Battletech, sometimes these basements were random. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily know that as a mech warrior, or they were assigned ahead of time. Random was always interesting because once you get into the heavy mechs and you've got that tonnage to throw around, smashing through buildings with your stalker like it's nothing, I mean, that's a viable tactic, but you might possibly encounter a basement. So now when we move to woods and parks, what you see here is that terrain can be destroyed. It can be set on fire. You could flame it out if you have a flamer or if you have inferno missiles. That is another possible interaction. There's rules for that. And of course, if you're caught in that, it's going to build up heat. Depending on the rules, there might be some cover with smoke in areas giving you that type of aspect, or removing the movement and the cover from the park or the forest or the trees immediately. Roads. Now, City Fight, City Tech, and you don't have to use all of these rules. When we usually play, we leave the rules out for roads because it's just one element that we're already playing with: setting stuff on fire, blowing stuff up, smoke effects, and the building destructibility. We just, for whatever reason, the group leaves out the ability of roads. They're treated as a regular hex map. Maybe your mechs have sticky feet or something like that, or treads to pull in. What's interesting on a side note, some of the older metal sculpts, there's a re-seen Thunderbolt. It's kind of the classic primitive Thunderbolt, and it's an older metal model. It's kind of interesting. It has this pose, and it's a good pose. It doesn't actually look goofy. It's not like the old Stalker mech. I mean, look, I love the Stalker. I will regularly play it. We won't even get started on that. But the old metal miniature, it's kind of goofy with what it's doing. It should look much, much bigger. Compare that to the Catalyst Stalker or your 3D print MechWarrior Online Stalkers. That's got some bite. But I say this because the older Thunderbolt T-Bolt miniature, it's running, and the pose looks really good for a metal model, and the arms and the joints, you don't actually have to pin stuff. It has one of its legs is back, and you can see the treads. You could see the grip of the actual foot pad of the mech. So sometimes maybe it might have that with how it plays. But there are rules where if you are running, Locust pilots need to be careful. Jenner pilots need to be careful. Hovers need to absolutely be careful. If you are moving in a straight line a number of hexes and then you bank or move off to the side, there's potentially pilot checks, or you might skid. You can be running like crazy, skid, smash into a building, take charging damage directly into that building. And if you're a light mech, just literally the impact of that based on your speed moving all out and how damage transfers, you just disintegrate and explode into a building. The first time that happens, you're like, what the heck just went down, right? So I say this because, yes, absolutely, Battletech can be played fully with full destruction, full battlefield effects, smoke, fire, removing stuff, blowing stuff up, and it makes for a very realistic and interesting game. And I would encourage you to approach that and play it, not only because, look, we're going to get the most out of our miniatures. We want to play different games, but also it's a way to explore vastly different tactics. And even if you have a smaller miniature collection where you're saying, Fritz, I'm playing the same miniatures over and over and over again, as soon as you change the missions, or as soon as you add a little total warfare, or add some of these extra optional rules that bolt on seamlessly, completely different way to play mechs. Completely changes the way certain mechs are played. And I think that's an important part of Battletech. But these are optional rules. You learn the core rules, you're ready, you're good to go anywhere in Battletech.